Good morning and welcome. I am so delighted that you've decided to join us for this conversation about the work of Joseph Campbell. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the newest title in the collected works of Joseph Campbell, Myth and Meaning, Conversations on Mythology and Life. We're also going to be taking a look at a new title we've just released into the world, the Mythopoetic Impulse. We are really excited to have you today, and I believe that you're here because you have an interest perhaps in the work of Campbell, but also because you, like us, are on a journey. You're searching. We at the Joseph Campbell Foundation are here today to invite you to experience the power of myth. So if you hear that call to adventure, you're in the right place. My name is John Booker, and I'm the executive director of the Joseph Campbell Foundation. I feel so fortunate to have the editor of Myth and Meaning with us today, our own Stephen Gerringer. With us as well, we've got Dr. Bradley Olson, the author of the Mythopoetic Impulse. The three of us are going to be having a conversation, and don't worry, we're going to have some time for Q&A. So feel free to send us your questions via that Q&A button at any time at all during the webinar. Before we go on, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce some of the incredible JCF team who are here today with us making this webinar possible. I am big fans of every one of these people, and I'm going to invite them to turn on their video here in just a moment. And today we have with us the brilliant Stephanie Zichowski, our operations coordinator. We also have the amazing Michael Lambert, who serves as our rights and permissions manager. We have the one and only Joanna Gardner, our director of marketing and communications, and myself, the executive director of the foundation. So with that, I'd like to invite the team to say a little hello and give you a greeting today as they introduce themselves. Stephanie, would you like to lead things off?
Sure thing. Thanks, John. And I just want to echo a welcome to all of you today. Thrilled to have y'all here. Thrilled to hear this conversation. I've been looking forward to this. I am the operations coordinator. I kind of keep things going in the background of the foundation, and I am looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Steph. Michael Lambert, jump in here with us and introduce yourself. Say hello today. Whoop, Michael, you're still muted.
Silly. Greetings, everybody. It is great to be here. I will be the captain of the chat today. I'll be dropping quotes and important links, so look out for them. As the rights and permissions manager, I deal with translations of Joseph Campbell's books all over the world and permissions to use his stuff in books and so on. So look for me in the chat.
We'll do just that, Michael. Thanks for being here with us today. Finally, Joanna Gardner, our Director of Marketing and Communications. Jump in here, Joanna. Say hello.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this Mythic webinar today. So excited to be able to share with you not one, but two amazing new books that the foundation is bringing out. I will be helping out in the Q&A today. So as John said, if you have any questions as we go along that you would like the panelists to address, go ahead and click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and put your questions there. And then when we get to the conversation portion of the webinar, we'll lift up as many questions as we can to bring them into the space with us. So welcome again, and I will see you in the Q&A.
Thanks, Joanna, and thank you, JCF team. These are an incredible group of people, and I am delighted to get to work with them on a regular basis. So appreciative of each one of you being with us today and giving those introductions and for making today's webinar possible. Now, this is a great time to open up the chat, everyone who's here, and let's hear a round of virtual applause for Stephanie and for Michael and for Joanna and everything that they do for the work of myth. We're so thankful for all that they do for us. And while you have that chat open, let's have a chat check-in. Let us know where you're zooming in from. We would love to hear what parts of the world that we've got participants in from today. And I'd also like to invite you to share any myths that are on your mind as we approach the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, and of course the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere. I'll kick things off. I'm joining today from the Los Angeles area, and a myth that's been on my mind is the Mawendo epic. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Mawendo epic, this is a tale that originated in the Congo among the Nyanga people, and it was primarily shared verbally from storyteller to listeners. In one part of the myth, in particular, of Mawendo's journey, and I should mention, by the way, Mawendo's journey echoes the journey that Joseph Campbell outlined in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's amazing how Campbell's idea about these journeys seems to pop up in myths all over the world. And in this one in particular that originated in West Africa, we find Mawendo encountering a character named Kati. And Kati is a hedgehog god that warns and advises Mawendo about the dangers ahead. Basically, Kati serves as a mentor to Mawendo. So mentors and their mythic power and presence have been on my mind a lot lately. Michael, do we have any other myths in the chat? I would love to hear if other myths have been on people's minds. Anything come up in the chat, Michael?
Oh, lots. Perseus and Percival, from Jean, the myths of the three Magi from Armando, the blue light fairy tale from Allison. Oh, the Christmas myth, which is going to be popular today, from Kimberly. And John, we have people from all over the world.
I am so delighted to hear that. I saw someone ask about the spelling of Mawendo. It's Mwindo, and there's a great translation of that epic that was released in 1969 that you're able to find out wherever you search for books. So I do recommend, if you've never encountered that West African myth of the Mawendo epic, check it out. It's incredible. And what a delight to have people from all over the world today, and these myths that are popping up in the chat. Isn't it good just to be with our mythic community? Isn't it good to be with people who see the value of myth and who have also been impacted and experienced the power of myth themselves? So a great big thank you to all of you who came today to experience the power of myth with us. Now, feel free to keep the conversation going in the chat, but if you have questions for our guests of honor today, enter those into the Q&A with the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, let's talk about some books. This is where I am so excited to tell you a little bit about what we have in store for you today. So let's jump right in, shall we? First, we've got Myth and Meaning, which is a new addition to the collected works of Joseph Campbell. It's just been out a few weeks. And the book takes a question-answer format, which captures and condenses Campbell's lively discussion sessions that followed his lectures. This book was compiled and edited by Stephen Gerringer, who you're going to meet momentarily, and it was taken from little-known interviews and recordings of Campbell's lectures. The book contains previously unpublished material that you'd be seeing here for the first time, and it covers topics ranging from the basics of mythology to the relationship between myth and religion and psychology and art to Campbell's own life and his career. Now, I've got a special announcement for you today, something I think you'll be very interested in hearing. From now through December 19th, this book is available at a 50% discount from New World Library. Let's drop that link into the chat. And by the way, I said 50. It's half off right now from New World Library. So you really want to check that out. Just to give you a little bit of a tease, here is a quote from that book that I find especially rich. Campbell said, "I can say from my own experience, for I have been teaching this subject for some 50 years, that when a mythic dimension is open to people, happiness, joy, and a sense of what might be called self-potentiality are opened to them as well." How rich. I can't wait to get into this book with Stephen here in just a few moments. But before we do that, let's also introduce you to another book that we are going to be discussing today that we have just released out into the world. This book is from Dr. Bradley Olson. It's called the Mythopoetic Impulse, and it involves Dr. Olson's selected essays that began back in 2017 and worked their way all the way up to 2022. It is such an engaging book, and it explores myth as it intersects with psychology, with literature, with art, with cultural studies. Each of these domains lends understanding and relevance to the others. This reciprocity enables deeper relationship to beauty, to the fascinating mysteries of existence, to nobility and creativity. I guess you could say to life itself. We are offering right now the ebook version of the Mythopoetic Impulse as a thank you gift from the foundation for all donations of $10 or more right now, all the way to December 31st. This is a beguiling, wonderful collection of material exploring Campbell's work, and you can get it just by donating $10 or more right now to the work of the foundation. Where can you do that? Go to jcf.org/support. We would really appreciate your support. We're so thankful for all that you do to make our work here at the foundation possible. Well, I think you're probably getting a sense of why it gives me great joy to introduce you to Stephen and Brad. Stephen and Brad, come on up to the front of this virtual room and let me properly introduce you. Stephen Gerringer and his wife, Destiny, live in Modesto, California. After 9/11, Stephen stepped away from teaching English and literature in junior high to pursue his interests in the mythic imagination. He's been working as an associate with the Joseph Campbell Foundation since 2003. Stephen has been with us a long time. While here, his responsibilities have included everything from writing and facilitating collaborations with other institutions, from speaking on mythic themes, and authoring books like Myth and Modern Living, which was just released last year. It's a practical Campbell compendium. It's another excellent book, and that ebook is available in our shop at jcf.org. So buzz on over and check that out and read all these brilliant ideas that Stephen has been bringing into the world. Speaking of brilliant, we also today have Bradley Olson. Dr. Olson is a former police officer and is now a writer and depth psychologist in private practice in Flagstaff, Arizona. He serves as the publications director at the Joseph Campbell Foundation, where he also edits and contributes to the popular Myth Blast series. You may know him when you hear his voice because he is the host of the Foundation's flagship podcast, Pathways with Joseph Campbell. Now, you can find out more about Dr. Olson's Myth Blasts and his podcasts and professional activities over at jcf.org. He's also got a personal website. You can check that out at bradleyolsonphd.com. So let's hear a little bit of virtual applause in the room for Stephen and Brad. Welcome them in the chat today. Now we're going to move right into the conversation, because this is going to be rich. I can already tell. So welcome to the webinar, Stephen and Brad. It's so good to have both of you here. I'd like to begin just by inviting both of you to reflect on this question for us a bit of what your experience was like working with this material and bringing this work into the world, because both of these books are the culmination of years of work. It's not like you just woke up one morning and put this out into the world. So let's start with Stephen. Stephen, what was your experience like bringing this material to the world?
Indescribable in many ways. This was first proposed to me in December of 2003 by Bob Walter, and who sent to me, well, actually, he drove down to my house in Modesto, a huge box with a stack of obscure interviews, that very few people had ever heard, and then also transcripts of radio interviews that were on local stations in different places, book tour interviews with newspaper reporters and so on. And then over time, also added to that were lots of Q&A sessions after lectures, because we've released a lot of lectures and far more are unreleased, but many of them had question and answer sessions afterwards that the public never had a chance to see because those weren't part of the releases. The question was what to do with those. So it involved I worked on this essentially from 2004 till 2019, when I finally completed the manuscript and turned it over to go through the pre-publication process. And spent hours, countless hours, listening to audio recordings, especially many that were never used, of some of these interviews and the lectures, getting down Joe's speech patterns, trying to figure out, what the different subjects were that we wanted to address. I'd spent years monitoring and administering bulletin boards on Yahoo and Facebook, and our own conversations of a higher order at the Joseph Campbell Foundation. So I had a sense of what people wanted to ask Campbell if they could, and that played into it as well. But taking these interviews and question and answer sessions and breaking them apart, because this was the only really way to approach it. We couldn't just publish 20 interviews that all had a lot of repetition in them. So doing that and then reorganizing them, coming up with new questions, some of which were borrowed from the chat, some of which were suggested by the material, and a few of which were kind of encapsulations of questions that interviewers asked. Sometimes, Joe would be on a book tour and someone who didn't know myth from math would ask him a question that really had nothing to do with the subject, and Campbell would pivot and answer what he wanted to. So the questions that we came up with were the beads on which to string these. And it took a long time to do that because there are so many different sources, and started off for years. I was surrounded in a sea of 4x6 cards. And then in 2014, a friend, Jessica Ewing, who later founded Literati, she was writing at the time and suggested a platform called Scrivener to me. And that just made all the difference because it provided an opportunity to sort this material and make it easier to put together. But it was a lengthy process, and at times Yeah, it felt like I was drowning in myth and drowning in Joseph Campbell's world, but it was just so incredibly enriching for me. And I hope it is for the reader too.
Well, as a reader of that material, I can definitely testify that that was the experience I had, Stephen. And it's such a rich book. I really feel like this book it brings Campbell's material to people, especially that may not be as familiar with all the depths of Campbell. It's a really accessible way to bring Campbell's ideas to people. And I know that's something I deeply appreciated about the book. Brad, let's bring you into this conversation. Tell me a little bit about the experience of bringing these essays and this material around Campbell's ideas to the world. What did that look like?
Well, these essays first entered the world in a myth blast form, and there was a time where myself and Lee Melander were solely responsible for churning out myth blasts every week, and they started out to be very short and very sweet, very small, not a lot of depth. It's just kind of a little bit of a taste of myth. What's happening on the calendar, what's going on in daily life around the world, that sort of thing. And these eventually evolved into longer pieces. And then we eventually brought in other writers, and these other contributors really lended a richness to this series. But these essays focus on the essays that I've written for the Myth Blast series over the years. And I've gone back and looked at them again, and some of them I really like. Some of them were sort of horrifying to read, but some of them I have edited and rewritten in portions because I no longer think what I thought in 2017 or even 2019 before the pandemic and those kinds of things. So what it does is these essays give me a chance to focus on my interests in myth, using Campbell as a springboard. And what I enjoy focusing on are as you said in the introduction, all these intersections of myth with psychology, with philosophy, with literature, with art and anthropology. All of these things I find to be just incredibly enriching and enjoyable. I like to focus rather than on symbols of myth and meaning. What I like to focus on is what does myth do to us? How does it understand us? How are the images of myth and the various narratives work on the imagination of all of us, billions of people that comprise the collective unconscious? And I wanted to touch on how mythic narratives empower us, how they connect us to the unconscious. They connect us to our vulnerabilities. They have the power to console and encourage us. And they place us in a more harmonious relationship to the conditions of life. And of course, those conditions of life were in existence long before there was a human being on the planet to witness them. And they're not always congenial to us human animals. And so by exploring these, the roots of myth in imagination, it gives me so much freedom to not only draw from Campbell's work, but from other mythologists, from other novelists who are often the best psychologists. It's just been a great joy for me to pull these together and look at them again.
That is really interesting. You talk about the intersections of myth and psychology and myth and symbols and philosophy. Stephen, I wonder, as you were working through that material, were there any intersections that you were surprised that Campbell made connections to? Were there things that he brought into the discussion that you said, wow, am surprised Campbell had an opinion on that, or I'm surprised he had something to say about that. You've immersed yourself in his work for so many years. What was it that that you found as you were going through this book that were intersections that might surprise us as readers? You're muted, by the way, Stephen.
My wife would love that button, by the way, to be able to use that every day on occasion. Sometimes I don't stop talking. Campbell goes in so many different directions, in anthropology and psychology. His discussion of philosophy intrigued me very much. Even sports he touches on, and television he touches on, so many different directions there. What personally touched me, as I worked with the material, as I was working through it. I mean, we always hear how important image is. Image is primary. In Joseph Campbell's work, James Hillman would point that out, and it is. But it's really, for Joseph Campbell, image feeds into experience of the myth, and that, to me, is what is most powerful about his work, and I think why it speaks to us, experience. As he discusses the value of image, the importance of it, you can see the evolution of image in his own work. And I have some visual aids that I brought with me, so I'll mention this here. I'm using this as a segue to jump into that. When he first started, with Hero with 1,000 Faces, this is the original editions, 1949. This is actually the second edition that Princeton University Press put out. That was the only one that was available until we released a revised edition with Joe's revisions in it in 2008. And in those days, images were plates that you would just put somewhere in the text, and Joe might be discussing that plate pages away from it, rather than having it right there in front of him immediately. And that's because images were very expensive and the technology didn't exist at the time. But then in 1955, he released his last work that he edited by Zimmer, called The Art of Indian Asia. And it's a 2-volume set, a huge set here. And one volume is all text, but along it, I think this is a section where he's talking about Durga, and the margin notes are mine, but he'll mention there's a plate, like here, plate 284, and the whole second volume is nothing but images. So you look that up and you find the image that he's talking about. So it's there with you. It's immediate. It's kind of a hard copy of the internet at the time. You don't click on it, you have to open the book. But that's still not quite as immediate for him. But it helped him understand the power of image and how important it was to get that across. This came out in 55. Eventually his lectures, he started using slides in his lectures, with the images. And in fact, Campbell didn't use notes. He worked off the slides. There was one occasion where his assistant loaded all the slides in the carousel wrong. It was a technician who belonged to the site he was lecturing at. So instead of taking the time to, delay the lecture and put the slides in the correct order, he gave the lecture backwards. And it still worked because he went off each image and explained it. But again, images are expensive when it comes to publishing. So with his Mask of God series in the 60s, he felt it was important for us to interact with the image and the text. So he hired an illustrator because we couldn't afford, the images that were here, and the technology didn't really exist at the time. So illustrators would put images in so he could talk about them on the page. Eventually in the early 70s, the Mythic Image came out, which was the last volume from the Bollingen Foundation, and Princeton University Press took it over. And here we have actual images in the text, but Campbell was only allowed 36 images, and there's countless discussions between Campbell and Princeton University Press about the images that could be put in. And after the first print ran through, Princeton University Press released a kind of a cheap knockoff of it where everything was in black and white. So here we have Jackson Pollock's Autumn Leaves in black and white, and you just don't get the power of the image, the leaves swirling, and the images that work through that. And that, ticked Joe off, so to speak. He felt they had abandoned his work. And that comes out in the second chapter of Myth and Meaning. And then eventually, when no one else would publish Campbell's work, Joe and Robert Walter and Alfred Vandermark, who was a publisher, they pretty much took all their savings, mortgaged everything they had to create their own publishing company, which published several works, but primarily was put together to publish the Historical Atlas of World Mythology. And finally here, Campbell was able to integrate text and images so he could be discussing on the same page the image, because with that, we at least get a sense of the experience of the myth. And of course, in the cultures where these myths came from, the images were three-dimensional. You're engaged in a ritual. You have a figurine in front of you, or you're on the sacred mountain itself. But the images are because myths come from visions, envisionments. And that's where, and this comes out in Myth and Meaning too, where Campbell differs from Levi-Strauss and others who felt myths were verbal. But a lot of the myths that we have are in kind of anthropological pidgin, where the Indians talking on the television how and in stilted language, and that doesn't capture the complexity of the actual languages that these were in. So image is incredibly powerful, and I wish Joe had lived for the full-blown internet age, because what he could do today with image would be powerful.
The power of the image. Brad, Stephen just brought up Jackson Pollock, and I know you in your work are someone that often looks to other artists and writers and philosophers and the influence that some of these important figures in literature and thinking have as we consider Campbell's work and myth. I wonder, in the Mythopoetic Impulse, are there particular thinkers or writers or artists that you tended to highlight and gravitate towards as you presented the work in the Mythopoetic Impulse?
There are. Thomas Mann, for instance, I find a particularly compelling artist. There's a German artist who's still living, as far as I know, by the name of Anselm Kiefer, and he has a piece in a very large room, and there aren't many other pieces of art surrounding it, and it's enormous. It takes up an entire wall at the Met, and it's called Bohemia Lies by the Sea. The first time I wandered through that guy, because I was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the whole Greek and Roman wing and all that kind of stuff, and just getting off on the old armor and statuary and all of this beautiful stuff that they have. And as I was leaving, I just kind of came around the corner and went into this room, and I was confronted by this extraordinary painting, and it's mixed media. It's got everything. It's oil, and it has ash, and it has burlap, and it has, it's just incredible. And from a long distance, and they give you that perspective in this room, you can have a very long view of this. it looks like this road going over a hill with, the sea in the background. And I was struck by the title. It's Bohemia is not by the sea, as far as I remember. It was landlocked in what's now, Bosnia and Serbia. But so right away, this work of art is in your head and turning things around and upside down. And this is, I think, what myth does. And I think this is what the mythic image does, to allude to what Stephen was talking about. Because, I remember Hillman saying one time that myth psyche is always mythologizing. And so we're always telling stories, and we're always creating stories, and especially about our experience. And I think the reverse is true too, that myth is always psychologizing. And so we get into this situation where we have to deal with irony, and I think irony is the foundation of myth. Myth doesn't play with form and context, content in a self-conscious way or a deliberately ironic way, but it's constantly calling up questions about its own authority, which is a tremendously ironic move. And it reveals this rather sly kind of self-awareness in some ways, a kind of cheekiness even, in that while they challenge the reader to take the narrative literally, they also function like a kind of Rorschach test that you can project almost anything you want on it. Now, all this subjective meaning can be very, very useful. And it still makes, in spite of all of that, myth still makes this demand for a unified collective reading. It's really an extraordinary thing.
If I could just comment on that, something that speaks to me is you mentioned that, Brad, and I noticed this in your work, and I've been reading your work since long before you were directly involved with the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Falstaff was my tutor, I think was the title of your blog, your award-winning blog. Yeah, and you have a wonderful way of words, but I love the idea of taking the perspective of myth. Myth isn't something out there, that we, interact with, that comes out from us. It is always humming along in the background. We're always constantly mythologizing, and myth itself, like archetypes, which myths are imposed or composed, pardon me. Joe mentioned they're as real as tables and chairs, the archetypes are. And that archetypology, that power of myth, it's not so much personalizing it, but I love your perspective of looking at things not from our perspective of myth, but what is myth's perspective and how does it relate to us? Same as with dream. The dream, I have the dream, but dream isn't in service to my ego. I'm in service to the dream.
What comes up for you, Brad, around that?
Well, I'm always intrigued by these movements in whether it's myth or whether it's psychology itself, the movements in these fields that seem to almost, in a way, stand against the field itself. And this is one of the ironies that I was thinking about, and I can't remember exactly how you said it, Stephen, but it really awakened this thought. And so Campbell loves Schopenhauer, and there's a lot to love about Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer is one of these philosophers who almost seems to stand against philosophy itself, much like Nietzsche does. And in a way, I think this is some of the pushback that Joe got for his work, because in some ways, in looking at myth through these four functions, he's sort of standing against myth itself in this kind of atomization of it. But yet, it still insists, his work still insists on this kind of collectivity and this wholeness. And it's a fascinating thing to me to run into that, which is one of the reasons Thomas Mann is so interesting to me, and Scott Fitzgerald is and Virginia Woolf are interesting to me in that same way. This is I think, kind of the ethos that Campbell was immersed in, which is in no small part due to modernism itself and the modernist movement in the arts.
I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A at the end, but I wonder, just in closing up our part of this discussion, if there might be a passage from each of your books that is especially resonant either to our conversation or to what a reader might take from the books that you have created here. And let's start with Stephen. Stephen, there are so many incredible things that Campbell had to say in this book. We could certainly spend another hour just quoting from the book, but is there something that might be especially resonant, or that might be something that potential readers could get a little taste of what is available in this book today?
There are a couple passages. I'm going to zero in on one, but also in his discussion of Black Elk and so on. That's another one of my favorite passages, which is in the first chapter. This one, though, is in the second chapter, an outline of everything, which is his discussion of the trajectory, the history of how myth developed over time. And taken from page 62 of the book, Joe's just been discussing how around 500 BC, we have this shift from myth to philosophy. This is the period of time of Pythagoras and Heraclitus and Buddha and Confucius, and possibly Lao Tzu, Zoroaster. All of these individuals are alive at different places on the planet at the same time. There's a lot happening everywhere in the old world. So Joe's been discussing this, and he brings up the perennial philosophy, and how this shift has occurred. So then the question is posed to him, this major shift happens in all these places at roughly the same time. Keep in mind, by the way, I'm not Joseph Campbell. I don't have his speech patterns down, but this is his reply. Yes, this starts in India, actually, with the Upanishads, but there's a difference between the way that happens in the Orient and the way that happens in the West. In the Orient, the key theme is tat tavam asi, thou art that. This appears in the Chandogya Upanishads around 900 BC in India. There's a wonderful, wonderful passage there where this old sage is instructing his young son. And he says to his young son, bring me a fig from yonder tree. And the boy brings the fig. The father says, cut it in half, split it, divide it. The boy says, that is done. What do you see there? I see these tiny seeds. Take one of those seeds. I've done it, sir. Split it, cut it in half. I've done so. What do you see? Nothing. Well, out of that nothing has come this great big tree. Out of that nothing has come the universe. Out of that nothing has come you. You are that nothing. Tat tavam asi.
Ooh. Wow. Thank you for that, Stephen. I'll be carrying that with me the rest of the day. Very, very powerful. Brad, how about you? Is there a passage that you think readers might benefit from today as we get ready to wrap our time up?
Yeah, this the paragraph I've chosen is from an essay called "Dear and Gorgeous Nonsense: The Poetic Impulse in Myth." This title comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was well aware of the materialist philosophy of the day and profoundly influenced by it. But he couldn't quite let go of Plato either, and he called Plato's philosophy dear and gorgeous nonsense. And so this is a little excerpt from that essay. Mythopoesis, true poetry, is the foundation of religious thought. Regrettably, the poetry of religion is, as Campbell noted, done to death by the clergy and rendered unimaginatively into uninspired prose and concretized dogma. The poetic impulse inspires what William James described as the potential for ontological wonder and cosmic emotion. And similarly, it lives in the first function of myth, which Campbell says in The Masks of God is to awaken and maintain in the individual an experience of awe, humility, and respect in recognition of the ultimate mystery, transcending names and forms from which, as we read in the Upanishads, words turn back. Because it's constituted by metaphor, poetry allows us to glimpse the ideal while still rooted in the real. It allows, even encourages, the double vision we need to make sense of the terrifying and fascinating mystery of existence and see in it an attitude of play, the divine play of spirit, the play of the élan vital, the dynamism of life itself. Nobility of spirit, the supremely aristocratic point of view, Campbell says, is the ability to play, whether in heaven or on earth. And always accompanying play are its daughters' laughter and delight. Play clarifies and unburdens. It lightens the load and often transforms judgment into appreciation. For example, Samuel Taylor Coleridge affectionately called Plato's philosophy dear, gorgeous nonsense. And Lionel Trilling called Finnegan's Wake transcendent, genial silliness that in its way keeps the world in its right course.
The Mythopoetic Impulse. Could we have some applause in the virtual chat for Brad and Stephen and this work that they've brought to us? And as you're appreciating them, Joanna, what sorts of questions are coming through in the Q&A? I'm sure I'm seeing there's far more than we'll be able to get to today, but what sort of questions are we seeing?
We're seeing many sorts of questions, John, and I would invite everyone again. Now's the time. If you want a hope of us being able to address your question, now's the time to put it into the chat. And I wonder if I might just like sneak in a little pre-question before we jump over to those questions. I'm so grateful for this conversation and for the work that you have both done, Brad and Stephen, in writing these books and in talking about them. I mean, in this conversation, I was feeling like we summoned the spirit of Joseph Campbell a little bit. I felt like he was in the space with us, and that's thanks to the work that you have done. So thank you for that. My question would be, how did the writing of your books change you? You know, you engaged so deeply with this material. We've barely touched the surface of it in this conversation today. And if you would like to share a little bit about how the experience of writing these books changed you, I would love to hear it.
Stephen, you're muted.
Stephen, your line is muted.
Sorry about that. I'll just go ahead and jump in and say it deepened my appreciation, not just for myth, but for life itself. And immersing myself in Joseph Campbell's work, in the myths that he was referring to, it totally changed my understanding of life and death. My willingness to embrace everything, to say yay to it all. A lot of things that previously were just head concepts, intellectual concepts, over time became part of my being. So it wasn't work. I mean, it was. My wife didn't see me for a couple of years there. You know, Joseph Campbell and the Joseph Campbell Foundation are the other woman, as far as she's concerned. Not really, but at times it did seem that way. But it was not work; it was a privilege.
Well, I think to answer that question, I think really the only reason I write is to figure out what I think. And in the writing of and the consideration of the topics of the essay or the associated material that helps develop the essay. I'm discovering what I think and what I feel about the world and about myself, and necessarily about this work of Campbell's. When I first started with the Campbell Foundation, I was not brought on board because I was a huge fan of Campbell. I didn't know Campbell all that well in the very early days. That has changed, of course, and I've made my way through all the collected works in the years since. But my appreciation for Campbell's kind of generosity of spirit really shines through whenever I move into his work, and that is something that I've noticed with people in this field. I noticed that particularly with John, actually, and I noticed that with my mentor David Miller, who was a brilliant and incredibly generous individual. So this is what this work opens up, I think, and it moves one into this kind of radical acceptance of life just as it is.
Thank you. Radical acceptance of life just as it is. Thank you so much. Okay, so with that, let's jump over to the Q&As that are coming in, and we have quite a few. One that it might be kind of fun to address is from Armando, who wonders, how does the myth of the three Magi or the three wise men factor into what we've been talking about today? Just a little bit of seasonal reflection maybe on that image, that mythic image of the three Magi / three wise men. And Brad, let's start with you and then go to Stephen.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't generally spend a lot of time in Christian myth. I still have some of the old time religion that I'm trying to, but what's interesting here is this idea is that they become aware of this divine child through the process of the natural world. It's basically that bright star in the east that speaks to them, right? And that's what draws them towards them with these gifts of and these are gifts of the natural world too, by the way. They're, the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh, all these are the gifts of nature. And so what you've got, I think, is several things. This deep connection to the natural world and the movements of the natural order of things. And this is one of the functions of myth, is to reflect the cosmic order in our daily lives, in the way we order our own societies. So we see that, but we also see the real genius of the early Christian church, which was to maintain these pagan mythologies in relative tact, and then spin them in such a way that this really makes this new emergent religious cult really appealing.
What he said, and I would also point out that on the one hand, the Magi are representatives of the Zoroastrian religion. So as Brad points out, it brings that into the Christian realm. But ultimately, these are three powerful figures, Magi, they're priests, or we three kings of Orient are, and they're paying homage to the divine child. And the divine child is what it's all about. Everything bows to that in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, but I think Brad basically covered it very well.
Awesome, thank you. So John, do we have time for another couple of questions?
I think we have time for at least one more. So let's
Okay.
definitely bring one more in, and we'll see how much time we have after that.
Okay, so leaning into economy of answers, I'd love to raise up John Selig's question. What would you say is the most practical takeaway from your study of myth and Campbell's work? Said another way, how has myth improved your day-to-day life, specifically or generally? And with this one, let's start with Stephen and then go to Brad.
Very similar to what I mentioned earlier. It's improved my life in that, it's taken me out of the driver's seat. I mean, I am here, but my world is created by me, but not the me that I think I am, the me I identify with, this greater self. So it's improved my life in helping connect to this larger self, and to trust that part of my being, which is definitely not my head and ego part.
Yeah, I think for me, myth is really a mode of thinking, and it helps me think more expansively about my world and myself and my movements and actions in the world, as well as with other people. I think it does the same. So that, I think, is the single biggest thing for me.
I think we do have time to get to maybe one other question. If the answers are that profound and efficient, I think we could do one more question.
Okay, so with that, I'd kind of like it to be a big question. And so this will be the last one. Carolyn offers that she's curious about Campbell's view or commentary about consciousness, its existence, its source. And so with this one, let's reverse again. Let's start with Brad and go to Stephen.
Well, Stephen's just compiled the whole book on this, so we'll see what meager orts I can offer here. But I think that Campbell doesn't really concern himself too much about where or what this consciousness is. It is certainly there, this dynamism of life, as he's called it. And I think this is one of the really brilliant things about Campbell. And his favorite metaphor, at least one of his favorite metaphors, is the light bulb, and asking what's important here. Is it the bulb, or is it the light that moves through the bulb? And so this is my understanding of Campbell's idea about consciousness, and he certainly is well read in Freud and in Jung. His introduction to the portable Jung, by the way, is worth the price of the entire book. And so he understands the nuances of consciousness. He certainly understands philosophers who've addressed consciousness. He was well versed in Kant and Schopenhauer, as I say, and Nietzsche. So I think he would be particularly intrigued. And this is one of the things Stephen mentioned. He wished Campbell were alive to have this technology at his fingertips. I would really love to see how Campbell would respond to the debate about consciousness that's going on right now, because it's really intense and fascinating. And what even is it? We don't know what consciousness is, let alone where it comes from. And so, to think about consciousness as epiphenomenon of brain activity doesn't seem to make any sense at all. But yet, if you move out of that kind of traditional understanding of consciousness, then you're called into question. About 5 or 6 years ago, Thomas Nagel, who's a marvelous philosopher, wrote a book called, I think it's called Psyche and Cosmos or something like that. And in it, he sort of attacks this traditional standard assumption of where consciousness comes from and what it is and how it functions. And he moves more and more and more to this idealist perspective of consciousness, so that which means that in the sense, consciousness is in everything.
And I would just, trying to keep it brief, I would, jump on to what Brad said, ride that, because consciousness for Campbell is a mystery. Everything, consciousness permeates everything. Rocks have a much slower metabolism than we do, but the sense is that consciousness is transcendent. So we don't know what it is. We can refer to it, as God. We can refer to it as a mystery. We can talk about the conscious universe. The brain, from Campbell's perspective, is just an organ that helps us filter and focus consciousness in our individual being. But when asked about, what happens at death, he says, well, consciousness separates itself from the body. Then he's asked what happens next. I don't know, but there's a sense that consciousness is not tied to humans. It doesn't come from the brain. Consciousness precedes everything, but it again is a mystery, and I don't think we're ever going to completely fathom it in this incarnation, metaphorically speaking.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Let me correct myself. I said Psyche and Cosmos, and somebody in the comments said that's Richard Tarnas's book, which is true. Thomas Nagel's book is called Mind and Cosmos.
Mind and Cosmos. Okay. And I would add also, I just re-listened to episode 1 of The Power of Myth, and Campbell has some interesting reflections in that episode. And so with that, I think we'll close the Q&A portion of our webinar today. And John, I'll hand the virtual microphone back to you.
Thank you, Joanna. I hope this has whet your appetite for both of these books around Campbell's incredible work. And as I mentioned earlier, New World Library is currently having a massive sale with 50% off all their books until December 19th. And that includes this new volume, Myth and Meaning, as well as the rest of the volumes of the collected works of Joseph Campbell that they also publish. A reminder, books make fantastic presents. In my humble opinion, in this holiday season, there's no better gift that you can give to someone than a book, and 'tis the season for gifting. So books make great presents. These would make great presents for those on your holiday list. So get on over there to New World Library and give your loved ones the boon of the power of myth. Also, we're offering the ebook version of the Mythopoetic Impulse as our gift for anyone that donates $10 or more to the foundation. Donations are 100% tax deductible from now through December. Well, donations are always tax deductible, but we'll give you this book from now through December 31st. The work of the Joseph Campbell Foundation depends on the generosity of people like you who are willing to invest in sharing the work of Campbell. We need your support. We're so grateful for the work that you've made possible, and we want to be able to bring Campbell's work and the mythopoetic ideas we've discussed today to generations to come and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to experience the power of myth. So in order to do that, please go to our website, jcf.org/support. And we hope that you enjoy the Mythopoetic Impulse is our gift back to you for your gift to us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a huge thank you to Stephen and Brad and Michael and Stephanie and Joanna and the full team that made this possible today. We'll leave the webinar open for a few minutes so that you can wrap up any conversations going on in the chat and copy any links that you need. And I hope that you enjoy Myth and Meaning and the Mythopoetic Impulse. Post your reviews on Amazon. That helps people find these books. Post reviews on social media. It spreads the word about this work. And most of all, have a beautiful holiday season. Thanks so much for joining us today.